the early part of 1941, the Philippine Islands were thought to be one of the safest places in the world to be. Few people ever thought that the war would ever reach the islands. In December 1941, war clouds hung heavily over the islands. 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese military order was sent out for all American and Allied civilians to surrender to the Japanese authorities. Over 6,000 American and Allied civilians were captured and taken to civilian prisoner of war camps, where they spent the next 37 months. They were crowded into Santo Tomas and Los Baños university campuses. These camps became organized cities of internees. Life continued as best as could be done under the severe and crowded conditions. Food was in short supply from the beginning and was a main concern for everyone. The Japanese military provided very little for their captives. If it had not been for the loyalness and generosity of the Filipino people, bringing food and supplies to the internees, many would have starved. On February 3, 1945, an American plane flew over Santo Tomas camp, dropping a pilot's goggle case with a note that read, "Roll out the barrel, there's going to be a hot time in the old town tonight." After crashing through the main gates of Santo Tomas, the two American tanks, the Georgia Peach and the Battling Basics, made their way to the main building with combat soldiers following behind them. The camp was shelled for several days by the Japanese soldiers on the outside of the camp. Many internees lost their lives after the liberation due to the shelling. On February 23, 1945, the 11th Airborne Paratroopers made a daring rescue of the civilian prisoners from the internment camp at Los Baños, freeing over 800 internees from death by starvation. The following are some of their stories.
This is Eric Neale, Santo Tomas, and he said he knew my father back in Santo Tomas, and very well, I think. Can you...
Yeah, you know him before the war, and
what did you do before the war?
he was with the pharmaceutical company. Yeah. I was with Manila Electric Company, yes, and when we went in, the group that was at the power plant was kept to operate the power plant for 10 months, and when we went into Santo Tomas, why, after I got my wits about me and started seeing what various people were doing, we immediately, that night, we went in there to Santo Tomas. We saw a sign that if we don't get any help tomorrow, the pots will go unwashed. So we, some of the group, we decided to volunteer for pot washers at Central Kitchen.
I understand that everyone had a certain job in the camp.
Supposed to have a job. Supposed to do a minimum of 2 hours work. Yeah.
And you worked in the kitchen, or
well, pot wash after they had cooked anything that they had available to cook. Mostly was, of course, corn and rice and whatever the Japanese allocated for the Central Kitchen. Getting back to your father, it was an essential job that a man of his capabilities and know-how to try to keep this problem that was running wild in the camp was rodents, and because it was amazing how these rodents, mice, rats, and the bed bugs in the camp was unbelievable. The university must have been loaded with bed bugs in its furniture before they turned it into a concentration camp. And they, because of the closeness of the people and living there 24 hours a day, it became worse.
hear that they will, every morning they would take the bedspreads out and put them out in the sun. And,
whatever they slept on, whether even they made these wooden lattice beds, and between the joints, it'd be just brown with bed bugs. Oh, horrible. We people who are not used to that type of life or environment, finally it gets you. And then you get used to it. Yeah, you finally get you. So you do. It's funny, every morning, like you say, they used to carry their mattresses, carry their beds if they had this wooden lattice bed, carry it down into the sun, and if they could just stand in line for boiling water to pour between the cracks and hope that get a good night's sleep the next night. And your dad worked diligently, more than a full day's work for the whole time that I was in the camp.
Do you remember talking to him?
Well, we used to talk, and he said, he said, I'm very lucky to be capable of doing this work, and I think that what I am doing is really of some good to the camp. And I said, I'm sure that it's more than doing some good. It's a shame that they don't give you the proper chemicals that you could formulate some type of solution that would wipe these things out.
What was your feeling? Tell me about you.
Well, just to give you an example of how people lost weight, I was 173 pounds when the war started, and when I was liberated, I was 129 pounds. And you can see by pictures that are published in Life magazine and various things, how they were practically. I figured if we hadn't been liberated on that February the 3rd, 1945, at 7 o'clock that night, we were planning to leave that camp, 3 of us, on the Monday, because we heard that we were going to be liquidated on the Monday. That word was able to be transmitted back to MacArthur's headquarters, fortunately in time for the 1st Cavalry to make their drive, a spearhead drive, to Santo Tomas, which is, as you will see in various articles that have been written by people who were part of that group, led by General Chase, that there were only 750 men. And if the Japanese had ever found out, we'd have been, that whole outfit and the camp too would have been wiped out. But they thought it was the main body that had come through. And fortunately, the word didn't get back across the river, that is on the south side of the Pasig River, to the headquarters. Yamashita had shifted across the river. So we were very lucky. However, there was several nights after that where all able-bodied men were issued firearms just in case.
I remember that right after the liberation, there was shelling.
Oh, there was shelling.
How did you fare on that?
Well, I was, how would you say, very lucky. I never got in front of one of those shells, but that continued for over 2 weeks. Yeah, over 2 weeks. And they were shelling from Intramuros and from the Paco Cemetery. They had
5 millimeters.
Yeah, they were
55. Actually.
Yeah, 55. Yeah, and they when MacArthur made his decision to start bombing Intramuros, because he was wasting a lot of time and a lot of men by just trying to get them to surrender. But knowing the Japanese, they don't surrender.
Well, the Japanese had Filipinos hostages also in Intramuros.
They had a lot of civilians. There was an awful lot of civilians in in Intramuros, and I don't really know exactly how many civilians, but I do remember going into, after the wall city had fell, that the aquarium, which was part of the wall city, had been converted into a hospital, a Japanese hospital, and they were carrying, the corpses still laying in the beds, iron beds, and what they did, the U.S. Army, to bury them, they just bulldozed a hole and just, it was just mass burial. There were some survivors, but it was, as you know, there was a lot of religious nuns and children, and there were some priests, Spanish priests, because you had 29 churches inside Intramuros, of which they thought that they would be safe. And unfortunately, the shelling and the bombing took the lives of a heavy toll, very heavy toll.
Japanese
And Filipinos.
Well, they said they shelled for 2 weeks, and the shells just came every day. How many shells fell in a day?
It was
like constant, or was it?
It wasn't that constant. It was because I believe that they knew that everybody would take safe protection by going on the other side of the main building. But everybody had moved out of one side of the building. Actually, everybody had moved outdoors onto the back side of the building. And that was very fortunate. They slept out there, right on the ground, on the other side of the main building. They were shooting from, as I say, from towards the waterfront, from the waterfront to Santo Tomas, and from Paco Cemetery, which was further south, towards Santo Tomas.
Why were they shelling Santo Tomas? Because it was
the army was there. The First Cavalry had already taken headquarters there. And Malacañan, they didn't know whether they were going to hit Malacañan or Santo Tomas or whatever, you see. Let's say, fortunately, they were overshooting Malacañan. Yes.
Falling in Santo Tomas.
Yes. And close surroundings to Santo Tomas.
It's sort of ironic. There was these prisoners that have survived 3 years and then only to die when the show.
It was, we had people who died after the First Cavalry came in. The fellows were so good that they gave them their, what we call that chocolate, 1 square a day. No, this was I don't know what brand it was, but it was 1 square a day. But if you give a package of 12 tablets to a man who hasn't eaten for 39 months, and he craved sweetness, and it was a very nourishing. We had about 35 people got diarrhea and died. Yeah. Because the system just couldn't, until people started realizing that our chow line, we remained on a very, how would you call it, a very palatable type of diet for people who'd been on a bad diet for 39 months. Then they slowly started we started making spam stew and things like that, and dehydrated potatoes and things like that. But
I remember there was a mess kitchen. Well, they say there was a mess kitchen set up right up.
I think it was. I think that was the C kit, K kit, or something. I just don't remember now what that was. But
would you remember the hostages that were taken in the dormitory?
That was in the
educational building.
Educational building.
Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, they fought there for a week. and they took that group of internees, hostages, and it was a standoff. No, because it was either that they didn't know how many Japanese were in the building. They had an idea because the Japanese had left us for a week. And then they came back, and then we really didn't know whether or not that they were going to just massacre all those people in the educational building.
What was the reason for them leaving for a week and leaving you all on your own?
They thought that there was going to be an attack on from Manila Bay. As the convoy passed Manila Bay entrance on its way up to Lingayen, that's when the Lingayen landing right after that took place.
There was also a mention where the commandant also told them that they didn't want all these horror stories to come out about how badly they were treated. And did they confiscate a lot of the papers that, or records that were kept?
Well, they had, all during the period of internment, why even our money you had to turn in at one time. As far as I know, I still have an account with the
Bank of Taiwan.
Taiwan, exactly, because I thought that you know, something may come out of it, and having undergone the sun cure with two other fellows, an American and an Australian, another, because of being in charge of the kitchen I was in, 6 of my men went out to see this September the 21st raid, and one Japanese soldier rounded them up, and I got him to release them, but he took me to the commandant's, to the lobby where we had our interpreter.
Commandant Hayashi?
Yeah, Hayashi, yes, who got killed. He didn't die right away, but the next day, Sunday, he died of hand grenade wounds that he received the night of the liberation when the 1st Cavalry came through the front gate. He was hit right there in front of the main building.
He was the commandant from early on, or was he came in later? Was he?
He was not the first commandant, but he had served frontline action and had been wounded, and he walked with a very bad limp, and he was at times very bitter. Talking to we received before he sentenced us to our sun cure was that the Americans had, or the Allied, the enemy as he called them, had bombs that were very, very dangerous, that it just killed anybody who was outdoors.
He knew that.
And that's why he did not want anybody watching any airplanes that were dropping bombs. That was his excuse. Yeah.
That's very nice. Okay, good. You're doing really good. Excellent. I mean, it's going to be really good.
From infants up to 10 years of age.
So you work for the Annex Kitchen, but there were
Mrs. Vivian Weisblatt was the head of the kitchen. I worked for her.
How did you feed almost 4,000? It was 3,800. I mean, you had 2 shifts or 3 shifts as far as feeding?
No, the children, no. We only had about, in that age group, I think the largest was around 700. Yeah. We were very lucky, and I do mention a trade name. The Red Cross was able to get from their warehouses laxogen. Yeah, it was laxogen, powdered milk, and that was made in. No, it was laxogen. Yeah, it was a Lycoclim. Yeah, that was what was used for the babies, and that was formulated in our kitchen. And these feedings were given to the mothers at the time of feeding. It was formulated on a schedule, the name of the child and the age and everything. And of course, we had refrigerators. They were domestic refrigerators, not commercial refrigerators. And these were kept especially for these formulas. And we used to operate from 6 o'clock in the morning up to 10 o'clock at night. And we had two qualified nurses that formulated these formulas. And then the other shift we had, I had all kinds of civilians, professionals, Pan American. I had priests that worked for me. All these fellows were really good workers, and we had a very willing group of what I called. I was young myself, so we knew we had a job to do until we were either rescued or whatever, and we faced it. We lived on rumors. We heard all kinds of rumors that used to come off of the front acacia tree round table, and we would digest it based on what we heard through other grapevines. And as we knew that the landing in Leyte had taken place in October, and it said, better late than never.
That came over the camp radio, right?
That came over, which was operated by Dave Harvey. Right. Yeah. So we knew that it was just a matter of time, but we also, I had been, while being a prisoner of war in the power plant on the island of Isla de Profesor, where I had access to listening to San Francisco. And I heard the Battle of Midway, and fortunately we knew who was the winners in the outcome, but we knew how bad Pearl Harbor was. So we really didn't expect any real quick relief. We knew it was going to be a long haul, and we settled down to that type of a livelihood. Our administration in the camp was, I consider it very well organized, and
miniature city.
it was a city all on its own. Yes. We had outer and inner law and order. We had as the rationing and food allocation, and we had very good people like Arthur Evans, who was in charge of the distribution of food based on what was being issued daily to the main warehouse where it was kept. And one thing that must never be forgotten.
It's true. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Good.
They would have an entertainment committee where they would have stage shows.
Yeah.
And they'd have panel shows, like game shows. And have actual contestants up on the stage, and they'd have, I think, like a charades or a game of, what do you call this, question and answers, and you win something.
Right.
And my father mentioned that also. And,
everybody who had, we had very, very few people that were not cooperating. Most everybody cooperated.
there was a lot of bitterness, and a lot of people just withdrew in themselves and just.
Well, you must realize that there was jealousy because some people had access to funds coming in from outside, and other people had better connections, both locally, and of course you had such a large Chinese community outside that trusting people who they knew, old residents of the Philippines, with an IOU. And when you figure you could convert good pesos into Mickey Mouse at a fantastic rate of exchange, and these Chinese knew that if these people survive, or their company would honor that.
That IOU.
Yes, and believe it or not, the Chinese must have thought they knew that who was going to be the winner in the long run. Yeah, it's just a matter of time.
The shanties were built when the POW was helped.
Relieve the congestion. Yes, which helped a lot.
And the funds for building the shanties were provided out of pocket.
Out of pocket. If you didn't have your own money, you couldn't build a shanty. People had lean-tos. Some people had quite luxurious nipa shacks made out of nipa and bamboo. But, like I say again, it was your connections on the outside as to your availability of financing.
Where did you stay? Were you in the gymnasium?
No, I never lived in the gym. I went into room 50, and I slept on the floor for about 3 months. And lucky I was able to get in there because of my brother-in-law. He was the monitor, and so a couple of the fellows that were with our group of 10, I was able to get into that room. Otherwise, and you were sleeping shoulder to shoulder with about an 8-inch aisle between two beds. If you called them beds, it was whatever you could knock together to sleep on. And of course, as you know, you had to have a mosquito net. So
there's one picture where I think I saw where it was, I think it was in the gym, where they had the mosquito nets were just, remember when it was a sea of white.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
And during the day they'd flip the mosquito net on top and they'd sit on the beds, all day or whatever. And,
well, you must remember that the gym had a more senior age group, and the gym got hit several times during the shelling, and I tried to. One of my very good friends was nicknamed Java. Was a Dutchman. He got killed coming from the gym, and shell hit, and a fellow by the name of Garrett. He was a mining engineer from Baguio, and I volunteered. We thought he was still alive, so we went through over to the gym, picked up a stretcher in the clinic in the gym. We didn't do that. We didn't pick up the stretcher right away because we didn't think he was that seriously hurt. Then Garrett got hit, and it took out a piece out of his leg. His right leg. He was on my right, and the shells were coming from the right, from could have been Intramuros or Papa Cemetery. Then I showed him where to put his hand to stop the bleeding, while I went back to get somebody to come and help me bring him in. And Java, I didn't even know then that Java was dead. But anyway, I got him back, and during that time, Dr. Bloom had gotten hit. Not a direct hit, but he had momentarily lost his eyesight, if I remember right. So we had to take him back to the gym, then from the gym to the main building, then finally to the the clinic there in the annex, where because they made in the back rooms of the main building, they'd set up a hospital, where the wounded, which had gotten hit by the shelling, our people, our internees, you see.
Well, I remember one part at night, it says, this was all the wounded from the shelling. And the shells would come in at night sometimes, and the bedspreads would billow out from the explosion and the flash.
Yeah, when it hit.
And finally, I think the Army decided to move them out.
Yeah, they did.
And they brought in ambulances and stuck them 4x4 in a row in these
Yeah.
these military ambulances, and they shipped them off to Christ the King. I think it was Christ the King or some other hospital just to get them out.
Out to Quezon City.
Out to Quezon City.
Right. That was a field.
That was
It
a
was
field hospital.
field hospital, right? I forget the 126 or something field hospital. I went out there, you know, to visit some various people that I felt, you know, I should go see.
But I
It
remember,
was like a castle, that hospital.
I know,
It was
it was run by monks.
right, correct,
Monks.
correct, right.
And I think it was my mother, of course, was on the outside, and you heard about my father being injured. My father had a through shrapnel wound from the shelling, right?
Yes.
And so he was interned, no, not interned, but he was in this hospital, and that's when he was moved out also. But mixed in this hospital were people that still had dysentery, and they had.
It became, as I said, it became worse.
Yes.
It was not a dysentery, it was just indigestion because of complications, because of the change of the diet.
The diet.
Yeah.
I remember
The food was too rich, for the system. The system couldn't digest it. You didn't have the digestive juices that you needed to control that diet.
Yeah, he mentioned also that there's a whole row, and the whole place was just filled with people with this problem, and they were screaming for bedpans, and there was American officers saying there aren't no bedpans, and it said, well, this guy's floating in his own, what,
Yeah, sure.
and there's just you can't stop it. They were just so they had to eventually take him out of there. And
Well, we found the best thing to do was to immediately put them on an old remedy that I had learned even back in China, was what they call in the Philippines lugao.
Oh, lugao.
It's what we'd been eating, for almost a year. It was 18 to 1, 18 parts of water and 1 part rice, and you boil it until it becomes a jelly. And that is the best solution that I know of. Even today, it's a good medicine, a good, how would you call it, controller. Yeah.
It's like chicken soup is for colds.
Yeah.
Can you recap you? Let's talk about you. I mean, you say you were in China. I mean, how did you get? You were employed by an American firm in Manila, or?
The company I worked for was owned by an American company out of New York, the Associated Gas and Electric, which was taken over by General Public Utilities during the war. The company was for sale before the war. My father was with the company. I got with the company. I joined the Manila Electric Company in 1934.
You were from China, or?
No, my father was transferred to the Philippines, to the Philippines.
You came out from?
I came down from China, from Shanghai, in 1927, 27th of February 1927.
So your mother and father?
And my mother and my father went down first, and then my mother and 2 sisters,
So they were all
we followed together. They were all in Santo Tomas. Yeah.
I just heard recently that your mother passed away.
She was 96 years old. Yeah.
1984.
84, correct. Yeah.
She lived. Did she leave any kind of writings or
No, fortunately she had a terrific memory,
good.
and she was my last line of communication in a lot of things that had taken place before that horrible 39 months. And she was good for remembering names.
You were, when you were liberated, you remembered the tanks coming in?
Oh, yes, yes.
What they said it was battling basics? And,
Yeah, right,
or was
right.
it the Georgia Peach?
Well, I don't know which one it was that came through first.
My
but-
father says it was Georgia Peach, and somebody says the battling basics. So, but anyway, from his account, that the Georgia Peach came in, and the kids swarmed the tanks.
Yeah.
And that the guns were hot. And they were telling the GI that was inside the tank popped the tank, his hatch. He says, "Get those kids out because the guns are hot." And he eventually jumped on the tank and says, "Give me a Lucky Strike, give me a cigarette." And they gave him a Lucky Strike, and so he had a great time. I mean, he got the cigarette.
They were the fellows were really good. They gave all the rationing, all the rations that they carried in their fatigue uniform,
cigarettes too.
everything, chocolates, whatever they had, And even the next morning, that night, we cooked for them their breakfast, in the annex kitchen. We cooked the kids regular cornmeal mush, but we were able to spike it with a little, like they had powdered chocolate and stuff like this, that we were able to make it taste a little more palatable.
Let me recap before the liberation. You said the food was running short, and
We just watered it down. Yeah, just watered it down. We knew how many ladles because of the number of people. So one scoop, one ladle. So you had to have enough to go through the whole line. So you get your 20-gallon container. You knew how many scoops were in there. You knew how many people were going to come through the line. So you said one scoop or 1.5 scoop or a half a scoop. Yeah.
So everyone had a little sort of a container.
Or can. Yeah, anything they could. Yeah, cans were the best. That was exchange.
I remember my father saved a can or a pan that belonged to Reverend Foley.
Oh,
I don't know if
he got killed. Yeah. In the shelling. Yeah.
And I have that pan at home, so we call it the Foley pan because from Reverend Foley, and so it's sort of like a reminiscent of a piece from Santo Tomas. So it's quite exciting. How do you feel about we're talking about that? Do you feel kind of...
well, at times it
hurt? Or
it does, yes.
Just
Remembering.
You have visuals of all your faces of your friends that either...
What I would suggest, and I'll give it to you before I leave, the name and address and telephone number of Al Palmer, who has footage of all of the in cam and the first ship out of Manila Bay.
How was he able to get all this?
He was with Warshipping. He was the official photographer for the Maritime Commission. And it's wonderful. He'd be only too glad to show you this footage.
Oh, great. That'd be wonderful.
He's trying to sell his library. It's a library of all of the I think it's worth about $500,000, but it's really worth it. It's worth it. He's got footage on just all India, all over the world.
Shouldn't this be actually purchased by the government or something, or you're not interested? Or?
They are, but they want somebody to donate it, and he is not right now in that kind of a financial position to make such a donation.
You have to have some kind of a funding to either purchase it and donate it to the Harley.
To whoever.
Smithsonian. Well, there's a museum, Hendersonville, in.
Yes. Well, maybe you could give me that address.
I will.
I'll pass that on to him. Yeah. But he shows, quite a lot of Manila right there at the during the liberation, and then the first internee leaving Santo Tomas, and then the loading on the going out on the docks out to the ships, and then taking the litter cases, tiered up as you say, 4 on each side, into the on board the ship.
A lot of the internees decided to stay. They didn't want to be repatriated out to.
No. Very few.
Their life is here in the Philippines. I mean,
Well, they came back, but they went back after, some of them. But we had on the ship I came back on, as late as May, we left Manila May 6th. We had 600 escapees. They claimed American citizenship because they were either American fathers or American mothers. Were never in any prison camp. But because of the question of whether they were or whether they weren't, I worked with the CIA to try to establish, which we picked up in Honolulu. We didn't go ashore. They came out to the ship. And then from Honolulu to San Francisco, those that couldn't speak English, I interpreted for the CIA agents, trying to establish whether, who was coming back.
you speak Chinese and Tagalog? No.
Just Tagalog.
Tagalog. Then you went back?
I spoke Chinese, Mandarin, as well as I spoke Tagalog, but there were no Chinese. They were all Filipinos.
So how long did you stay in Manila till when you...
Well, we used to come back every 3 years on vacation. Since I joined the company, that was 34, every 3 years. But as I say, I'd been in and out of the Philippines, back to school, and before that.
Did you ever get any kind of, there's a War Claims Act in 1940. Nothing. Civilians didn't get anything.
Not to my knowledge.
I think my father received something.
Well, there were some that were compensated. He was wounded, wasn't he?
Yeah, in the shell.
So yeah, it could have been from that. I believe that there were certain. Now I know of a very well. Actually, we were related by my first marriage. She was of Cuban American. Her father was an American, mother was Cuban, and she got compensation. But she was raped by a group of Japanese. They lived right opposite the LaSalle College, and you know what happened to LaSalle College?
Yeah, it's just I have a picture of
the chapel?
Yeah.
The dead in the chapel?
No, I just have the building.
Oh, God.
They just mowed it down.
Ooh, hand grenades.
I think they were paying the internees like so much a day. And
Never materialized. Never materialized. Still pending.
Do you remember John Seiler?
The name sounds familiar. Yeah.
He was an ex-teacher. Those teachers
Yes.
that went over.
Right.
And there's also Magna.
Yes.
Magna.
They actually, we had a school in camp. I had a very good friend who unfortunately was killed long after liberation. He worked for General Electric. Had what I considered real far-sighted. He took Chinese, Mandarin, while he was in camp. Besides his regular job, he worked on the central kitchen line. He was a server.
There's another guy. There was a guy by the name of William J. Town. Are you familiar with
The name? Yeah, I know the name.
He worked with McCall. McCall also did the book.
Yeah, they were printing.
The printing.
Yes. They were the Philippine Education Group. What was the name of those fellows, Julian? The McCall Group. Who were all those old timers? They were Spanish-American War veterans. Yeah. That goes back. McCall goes back to Spanish-American. They were like lieutenants during the Spanish-American War who decided they stayed behind, like Charlie Armstrong's father and people like that. They're of the Spanish-American War time. A lot of them came from Nebraska. There was I forget the regiment, Nebraska first something came.
They were the old soldiers.
Yeah, also Spanish-American War veterans.
So McCall did some did some cartoons and drawings and turned it into a book called Santo Tomas STIC and Verse, or in reverse. And WJ Town is mentioned in the book, at least helping.
Well, yeah, you know, Stephen.
Frederick Stevens.
Yeah, the one who wrote the book, Santo Tomas, mentions the three, but he doesn't mention our names, having the sun cure. I don't know whether the, what's her name, Carly girl, did some sketching in that book. I believe she did.
Kate, no?
Yeah,
Kate?
yeah.
I didn't see any.
Ask her. She,
I must have some sketches or pictures somehow. I'm still searching.
I had some, but in my moves, they got misplaced, and you know, I had a wooden chest that I had a friend of mine in camp make, who dovetailed it. I made it out of a packing box, and did a wonderful job. I never painted it because it looked so pretty, and I kept that for years, but it got lost in the movings.
Certain names I'd like to mention. Of course, you know Duggleby and Earl Carroll.
Duggleby, and Duggleby did a wonderful job for the families of, again, you talk about Spanish-American War veterans mostly, who were married to Filipino women who had children on the outside. They ran. Duggleby was the one who saw that money was given to their families, where they got it. They raised this money, and he was the one that paid out to these people, whatever, every week or every month or every 15 days. And whether it was Cumming Johnson, who was with War Shipping, I helped to recover the bodies of those.
Who were they? The Duggleby.
There was the Wrong Larson.
Yeah, the Wrong. There was
and Johnson, who was War Shipping.
What's Johnson's full name?
Johnson. Yeah, he had authority to sign, I believe, don't quote me, U.S. Treasury checks. They tore his shanty apart the day they picked him up, looking for checks or evidence of his association, but it made no difference. The reason how we found out where they were, we didn't know that they had been beheaded, was through a Filipino doctor who was taken out of Fort Santiago in the same vehicle, and he saw the very close blings of Johnson, because Johnson wore shorts, and he saw through the blindfold these, and then we knew. And he said, you remember Kalibatarti, the Kintai at the American school. It was called the American School in those days, before the war, on Kalibatarti and Del Pilar. And from there, Filipinos told us they took them out to that field, which was Fort San Abad. Then there was a big pit. There were 23 nuns in that pit.
With the four. Did they ever?
I met the son of Johnson. He came. He was in the Navy. He got when he landed in Leyte, he was able to get permission to come up to Manila, thinking his father was alive. Unfortunately, a fellow by the name of Kelly, very good friend of mine. He and the son, we followed this thing through, and it was too gruesome. It was more palatable. People used to say, why is the annex kitchen, it's cornmeal mush, so much more palatable? And it was because we cooked it so much longer. But you've got to remember, we're feeding less than 1,000, they're feeding 3,000, you see. So, again, you know, it's how much heart you put into your work. You know.
Certain people have privileges. My father had privilege to leave the camp. I mean, with his armband, but my father to go
and get chemicals.
Yeah. And I remember my father mentioned that he'd go to the bodegas where they kept all the food.
Yeah, well,
and he had a little box where he had put the dead rats in. Also, he had one section where there was a live rat, and he'd build a little trap door. When he'd get into the bodegas, he'd open up the trap door, and he'd drop the food in. He'd do some looting himself, and he'd put in some camotes and some rice or whatever into this little compartment, and then slam it shut and let the live rats on top and the dead rats on top. It's like a big cage. And when he'd walk out, the Japanese guy would say, and they're afraid of him.
Yeah.
And of course, my father sailed right through. And
we had a group come up from Davao.
Mm-hmm.
The camp in Davao, they brought them up by ship, but they kept them quarantined for quite a while because they thought rumor was that they had bubonic plague. One had gotten bitten by a rat on the ship coming up, and I think we were all, if I'm not mistaken, we were all given shots at that time. They were always giving us some kind of shots for something.
Well, the Japanese were very scared about the epidemic in case, because they say if it affects it will wipe out everybody. Right. So that's why they brought my father in and a few other people, and they said, this is a problem and we need to take care of it. And so they gave my father almost quite a liberty to be able to
that's where they realized the need to protect themselves, you see.
Right. And so my father had a shanty away from everybody else, because he was doing all his testing of his bubonic plague and the fleas and the rats.